Hello, I'm Miss Macmullen and this is Macmul Literacy. We're on week 9 already, and this week we are starting to look at exam questions, so questions that you come across in an exam. So this week we're looking at 4 words, next week we'll look at another 3. You might be familiar with these words already, but are you comfortable spotting them one from the other? So this week's words are identify, describe, explain, summarise. Could you tell the difference if a question asked you to do one of them over another one? This week I'm also going to ask you to dual code. So to remind you, dual code is when we create a symbol that represents that word to us. So the to us section is the most important bit of this, because it doesn't matter if I understand why you've used that symbol. That doesn't matter at all. What matters is that you understand it. And this could be really useful when it comes to these words, because when you're revising, if you put this dual code next to every question that uses this word, then it will help your magical brain do superpowered things and figure it all out. It's incredible. So let's talk about the first word, identify. Let's talk about identifying. Now this comes from a combination of the Latin word identitas and the Latin word ficar. Well, that one's more of like a part of a word. So identitas is identity and ficar means, or ficare, maybe, I don't know, I don't speak Latin, means to make. So this makes it a little bit confusing. We know what identity is, I assume. Your identity is the characteristics that make you who you are. Now, the fact that it's a combination of make identity kind of makes it sound like you're creating a person. That's not it. Don't get confused with that. What it's actually saying is more to do with find identity. It's a little easier if we look at the French version of the Latin word identitas, which turned into identité around 1600. This meant sameness, oneness, or state of being the same. So you can see that when you're asked to identify something, you're asked to look at what the question is asking you to identify and then find the same thing in your source. So find the same. And that is simply all that you are doing. You are finding. You're not explaining, you're not describing, you're not going any further, you're simply finding. So identify is a really simple, straightforward question. Now, my example of a question that asks you to identify is from Geography GCSE. Identify the glacial landform at grid reference 653735. That's simple to you, I assume, if you study geography. You can see it's just asking you to point out what glacial landform there is there. Now, I didn't take Geography GCSE, so I haven't got a clue. Also, I don't have the grid there, so I can't find it. But you get the point. You'd be looking for it. If I said, identify the country at grid reference D3, you'd simply say which country that was. It's Italy. Woo, we win. Now, describe. Describe comes from the Latin prefix di and the Latin word scriber, scribere. Maybe I should look up Latin pronunciations because I think that I'm murdering them. Now, D, the prefix, means down. It does that in many other words. So like decline, depress. If you depress a button, you push it down. And scribere, that word means write down, and we get that in things like scribe. It's a scribe is the person who writes something down. To scribe is also a way of saying to write down. So both of these parts of Latin have come through to English in quite a strong way, and you will be able to translate this knowledge and decode other words as a result of this. So down, write down. So when you're asked to describe, it's asking you to write down. So when you're asked to describe, you are saying what you see, essentially. So you are writing down what you see. So if you're asked to describe a graph, you will talk about the slope of gradients, whether it's linear, curved, things like that, what's on each axis, and so on. So that is a description. You also get descriptions in descriptive writing in English. Now, on to the next word, explain. Now, explain requires a little more explanation. Explain comes from the Latin explanare, which is based on planus, which means plain. Essentially, your job is just to make it really plain and clear. So I've taken some examples from science for when you would need to explain something in a GCSE exam. So explain the effects of smoking on the human body. You might say something along the lines of the lungs become inflamed and mucus builds up. Furthermore, breathing becomes impaired. And if you smoke during pregnancy, it can increase the chance of miscarriage, cause lowered birth weight, and increase the chance of respiratory problems later in life. You can see there that I've gone further than I have when I've identified. I've talked about different aspects. Here's another example. Explain the effects of obesity on the human body. Obesity causes high blood pressure and leads to fatty deposits. This increases the chance of cardiovascular problems, and it also increases the risk of type 2 diabetes. This is where the body's cells lose their sensitivity to insulin. Fat intake and obesity can also increase the risk of certain cancers. Again, we've gone into more detail explaining, but we haven't really inferred anything. We haven't figured things out. We haven't put our own spin on it or anything. It's still very straightforward. It's just a bit more detailed than identifying. So you can see when you were asked to explain, though you were simply responding to the question in quite a simple way, you were using knowledge that wasn't on the test paper. When you were asked to identify or describe, that is information that you can see in front of you. Everything that you need is there. When you're asked to explain, you're asked to bring prior knowledge, go further into detail, but not quite yet make any inferences. Sometimes a question will ask you to describe something that you can't see in the exam paper. For example, if a question asks you to describe the effects of exercise on the body, then you can say exercise causes an increased heart rate, or exercise causes sweat. Now, if you are asked to explain the effects of exercise on the body, then you would talk about why those things happen. So you would say the heart rate increases because, and talk about that. If you were talking about sweat, you would say the body sweats because, and you would go further on to talk about why that happens. So explains are the why, describes are simply the what. The what, describe, the why, explain. When responding to a question that asks you to explain, you will often use the word because you are bringing your own prior knowledge to the question. So summarize. Summarize comes from summer in Latin. No, not summer. Summarize comes from the Latin word summa. Not summer as in the season, S-U-M-M-A. This means whole or quantity of, and it's where we get sum. And when we're asked to summarize, we're just putting everything into one piece. We're abbreviating essentially. We're picking the main points out and we're just stating them. We're condensing it into one simple point, or a few simple points if it has a few simple points. So this kind of question you will see in English GCSE. On paper 2, it asks you to summarize the differences or summarize the similarities between two different texts. So what you would do is you would pick out the main points of each text and be like, this text does this, and this text does this, and this means. And you'd make an inference. If you're not up to GCSE yet, just still listen, because you are going to need so much of this information. So that's summarize. Okay, so they are our 4 words. Hopefully you will have done a dual code for each one of them, but if not, I would like you to do that now, please. So to create a little symbol. So to identify, which is the really straightforward one where you're just picking out bits of information. To explain, which is where you are taking your previous knowledge and applying it in a pretty straightforward way to what the question has focused on. To describe, which is where you are writing down what you see essentially. And to summarize, which is when you are taking the main points of perhaps a larger piece of text or a graph or a table. Now I'm going to ask you to spell them, which is fun because you know you're going to see them written down in the exam, so you don't need to know how they spell. But sometimes it won't be the exam and you will still just need that information, and it will help you to spell other words. Just do it, okay? So, first of all, identify. Describe. Summarize. and explain. Amazing. So check your spelling there, and then we will try it again. Fantastic. So let's start with summarize this time. Make sure you get the right amount of M's. Identify. Explain. And describe. Here are the correct spellings. Check them before we do it for a last time. Now note that summarize is spelt with an S. If you're spelling it with a Z, that would be the American spelling. And for the last time, describe. Summarize. Explain. And identify. And there are the correct spellings. Now, if you could write down the correct spelling of the word, your dual code and a definition for this week's words, then next week we will go on to look at some of the more complex words that you will come across in exams. Thank you and goodbye for this week. Thank you for joining us for another week on Macmo Literacy. If you enjoy starting with a word and then ending up in a rambling journey to who knows where, then I suggest that you hit like and subscribe. Also, if you just want to be a pal, like and subscribe. See you next week.